But Dr. Ashwin, traditional politicians are averse to changes, particularly if particularly if the power gets diluted. How will you deal with them? In any case, you need support of the majority to bring about the changes.
Well, that's true. But I also think change is happening. These same politicians were averse to the Lokpal bill too. What we brought it before them. I also believe that the movements like the India Against Corruption movement will continue. They will move from one issue to another. We will, I am sure, in the near future, see even more demands for public participation in government. The Lokpal is just the beginning. I'm reasonably confident that in the next year, we will move to direct democracy, public participation, and those sorts of things. And the kind of politics that I'm saying needs to happen will benefit from all of this anyway. You don't have to do it for that reason. But I think the window for good politics is becoming wider and wider, and more people will be able to get into it because there is a reform of the traditional system.
Dr. Ashwin, you have been interacting with politicians.
Yeah.
Why is their credibility so low? What do they lack?
Two things, and I'm going to say the first thing. I know a lot of political people, and when I say this, I don't mean to insult any one of them. But the reality is they have not come through a system that brings both competence and purposefulness. Essentially, when you get elected, you have to know what it is that you're trying to achieve. And the people who are working with you should also know that. If they don't know that, they can't actually work with you to enable the outcome that you're going for. Too many of our politicians are getting into public office and later trying to figure out what it is that they're going to do in politics. It can't work like that. You must have an idea of what you're trying to achieve before you go there. I always say, hope is not a plan. Right? You can't hope to achieve something and say, I'm going to go and get something done. People will support it out of maybe party loyalty, historical loyalties, ethnicity, like I said, caste. But that doesn't mean you can get anything done. Politicians today are struggling with two things. Their own incapacity to lead the administrative apparatus. And second, the weaknesses of the administrative apparatus itself. The reality is, and I know this, I was 2 years in the Administrative Reforms Commission with Dr. JP and Mr. Moily and a few others. And there, one of the things we discussed repeatedly is, we've got a system of administration in which good people can get to important jobs, certainly, but there's no assurance that those important jobs will continuously be manned by good people. So occasionally you may get a head of the BBMP who is very good. Occasionally you may get a head of the BMTC who is very good and the traffic police who is very good. But the system doesn't guarantee that you will get a series of good people. And the reason it doesn't guarantee that is the way the administrative system is set up itself. You are in youth and sports today, then you're in agriculture, then you're in whatever finance. You can't really accumulate competence at the level that international cities are now able to. All said and done, the head of technical institutions, if you go to the head of London, what is called TfL, Transport for London, the head of Transport for London can stand in front of a public forum on transportation anywhere in the world and speak spontaneously for 45 minutes. We have not built that kind of competence. We may occasionally get a DLT commissioner like the current one who's capable of holding her own in a public space. But there have also been others who simply were not up to that kind of competence. So what I would say is we have an administrative system that is weak, and because the political system doesn't bring outside competence into it, they're unable to move this administrative system along. The administrative system also has one other failure. Imagine that you are number 2, number 3 in one of our state agencies. You are told repeatedly that the top job is always reserved for somebody from the outside, from the administrative services. This is not very motivating, fundamentally. I mean, everybody knows organizational motivation is important. One of the consequences of the generalist administration service has been that internal competence within organizations is not allowed to rise to the top. And eventually people start to say, I know somebody who used to be number 2, number 3 at ISRO. And so, well, I'll never become the head myself. Or somebody else will say, I used to be number 2, number 3 at this agency, BESCOM, BMTC, whatever. Once they recognize that their careers are sort of stagnating because of the way the administrative system works, they may leave. In fact, even in the IAS, there are people who are leaving, saying that the opportunities are diminishing, the leadership opportunities are diminishing. And we have to address this.
Dr. Ashwin, Like people, like politicians.
Yeah.
They are the two faces of the same coin.
Yeah.
Do you accept this?
No, I think like people. That's what I would say. What do I mean by that? Politicians cannot be separate from the people. Politicians have to come from the people, ideally. It cannot be that you have a class of people who should provide leadership, but their connections to the people they are supposed to lead are tenuous. Today that happens because of the ticketing system. Random people from, it's from unknown backgrounds, from unknown levels of competence, can emerge in the system simply because they've been handpicked by the parties for one reason or the other. Now that has to stop. And ideally, parties should conduct internal elections. Parties should conduct transparent campaigns for long periods of time to convince voters to vote for them. The irony is that even though the majority of parties are losing under the current system. Here's the thing, I want to say that again. The majority of political parties inevitably and invariably lose under the current system. What do I mean by that? You take a party like the CPM, or the Republican Party of India, or or even one or two of the smaller parties in Tamil Nadu, or even in India, in Karnataka itself. You can always find parties that you can say consistently, they will never form the government. Right? So the number of parties about whom you can say they will never form the government is quite high compared to the number of parties about whom you can say they have a chance of forming the government. But even the small parties have not embraced electoral reform, have not embraced political reform. Right? And there's some interesting thing in it. If you say, for example, one of the things that we surely need is proportionate representation. If a party gets 5% of the vote, they must get 5% of the seats in the assembly. This is common sense because they represent 5% of the people. I always say the countries in the 4 continents that are leaders in their own continents, South Korea in Asia, South Africa in Africa, Brazil in South America, and the Germans in Europe. Each of these countries has a much more representative system of government. They have a way of bringing the political leader up from the bottom, moving him through multiple tests and filters until he is affirmed by at least 50% of the people. If you get that, you get genuine leadership and the country can move forward. We have a system of leadership in which the guy who gets 12.5% of the popular vote becomes the prime minister. In some cases, he doesn't even contest the election. So you've got a scenario in which even after your so-called election, there are more people who believe he does not represent me than people who believe he does represent me. You can't get leadership through this process.